We've seen in recent times what you said at that inaugural lecture about public sector workers being overpaid. There's been a lot of talk about it. It appears some people don't really understand what you're trying to say. So the question is, what do you mean when you say public sector workers are overpaid? Very simple question, but it's important we get the ground rules right. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you once again. The bottom line is that I never said public sector workers are being overpaid.
You never said that?
No. I didn't say public sector workers are being overpaid. I introduced the conversation on productivity, and indeed, I did it in the context of 4 other variables. So essentially what I sought to do is to start a conversation that says that the formal sector, which is mainly public sector, contributes 3/4 to our GDP. 3/4 to our GDP. Our huge informal sector contributes only 25% to our GDP. The next thing that I sought to do was to demonstrate the inequalities in earnings that we have. And unfortunately, as a country, we've been reporting consumption expenditure inequality. So what my lecture sought to do is that first picture that clearly demonstrates the contribution of the formal sector to our GDP, which, as I said, is mainly public sector driven, and then say that if you look at inequalities from an earnings point of view, based on data from the public sector, we have very stark inequalities. And I demonstrated that with what in economics we call the Gini coefficient. So once the Gini coefficient is closer to 1, it characterizes a perfect, a near perfect unequal state. Then using the data on earnings, I showed that the Gini coefficient was 0.71 if you took away the outliers. Then the third variable that I talked about has to do with productivity. And I said, if we always have been releasing GDP and we don't measure productivity, how can we track the progress that we want to make on GDP? Then I said, look at our population that are employed from the census, look at our GDP, and then this is the output per person, and this is the earnings per person in the public sector space. This is a conversation that we should have, because in economics we say that what you earn should be equal to your output, and that should be equal to what you spend. But we are seeing this disparity. And I only use the public sector as a proxy for earnings. And indeed said, even if you throw in the earnings within the private sector, which we all know that is higher than the public sector, we're going to see a wider variation between our output per head as a country and our earnings per head as a country.